thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you. You are one of my favorite content creators in Substacks. Tell us how it is that Nigeria wound up erasing its history. Please explain.
Well, thank you. Well, it's an interesting situation. First of all, thank you for being a supporter. I know you're one of my first supporters on Substack.
Yes.
So I really appreciate that. Well, it's interesting. So late 70s, early 80s, the Nigerian government, it was sort of a gradual thing. So what happened, first of all, was that history was no longer mandated in schools. And what they did was they introduced a subject called social studies. So I went to school in Nigeria in the early 80s and I did social studies. And it wasn't till recently when the presidents reinstated history that I realized I never did history. So what social studies was it's sort of like a civic education because we just had a civil war. So that was 1967 to 1970. And what they wanted to do was to rebuild the nation. And it was more of a psychological social engineering kind of program where they didn't want people learning about history per se, just the nuts and bolts and facts of it, but they wanted very, very specific ideology to unify the people. Because if you think about it, the more that they learned about the true history of Nigeria, the origin, the colonialism, where we came from, what the tribes were, the kingdoms, it will be very, very difficult to justify the Republic of Nigeria. So that was the reason. And listen, there's disputes as to whether that's, that is the only reason because they gave a bunch of excuses. But that is what I believe is the truth. I mean, they said it was the teachers. There weren't enough teachers to do history. They said that history wasn't a viable subject for employment, that there wasn't enough interest from the students. But I believe it was a political thing, personally.
And the thing is, we were talking about before you come on, is that the parallels to what is being done in the United States, I think, are really kind of mind-blowing, right? Because this idea that if you just don't tell a generation of Nigerians, in this case, what the history is, then they can be unified. But that if they know about the Civil War, if they're aware of the history, that somehow they won't be able to build one nation, to me seems a bit infantilizing to a people. But it's being done to us now. So tell me, how has that impacted Nigeria? Because it was done there.
Oh, no, it's been extremely bad. I mean, look, if you go to the average Nigerian on the streets, they don't know what years the Civil War was fought. They don't know what the two factions were, the reasons for the war, none of those things. In fact, we know more about colonial powers and the British Empire than we do about Nigerian kingdoms and so forth. But the parallels between what Donny T is doing in the United States and with the Smithsonian Museum and the executive order, I think it's 14253. The irony is that his statement is he says he's restoring truth and sanity to American history.
Right.
That's what he said. And what truth is the question that you would really ask? And the way that I look at it is that what he's doing and what the government of Nigeria did is actually the same thing. It's really about controlling narratives and controlling the perception of history. Because right now we're making history. So the more that you can control a narrative, the easier it is for you to manipulate a population. Okay. So I think when you look at why he wants to take out slavery or slavery artifacts and memories of slavery from schools,
Joy Reid, because it's my first time listening to a podcast, but great content. And the Merc, I haven't heard about him until this came up in my feed. So I'm glad I heard about him. Shout out to him. Always, enjoy people who talk, various things about the continent. Look, this is very interesting to me because when you talk about social studies, right? So I remember because I did secondary school in Nigeria, of course, and I finished secondary school in Nigeria in 2004. And even in my junior years, because from what I'm seeing here, it seems like the history was moved in 2007. Prior to 2007, I don't know. It was always social studies because in my JS1, JS2, and JS3, history was not compulsory, and history was not part of the subject. This is confusing me a bit. I don't want to stray from the discussion, which is Nigeria erasing its own history, but just to kind of stay foundationally firm on what they're talking about. Now, social studies didn't talk about history. Like social studies, I think social studies was more about Homo sapiens and It was more of a very, very all over the place subject, which we all did in Nigeria in secondary school. And then I remember when you got to the senior secondary level, and I know kind of, and maybe this is in public schools, but in private schools, you had the option of doing history. It was, if you're an art student, you could either, in my school, you could either do history or something else. It was two, you had to make a choice. And I didn't do, I think I did government, not history. I think you had to choose between the two or something like that. Because I was an art student, I wasn't in the sciences. But this is an interesting subject because I never thought about it in this way, which is interesting. So here are my takeaways from that discussion. I don't think there's a parallel between the US and Nigeria. I think it's kind of, we're going to the extreme here if we think there's a parallel to make. I think there are two different dynamics, two different countries. There's no way you can correlate what happened in Nigeria to what's happening in the US. I think it's kind of far-fetched to do that. Although there are certain elements that we can draw from, like at the later point, talking about trying to control the narrative, I think that is a point that can be true. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I do agree that removing history might have been a political move. I don't wholeheartedly agree. Because yes, various times governments try to control the narrative, which could be true. But I do agree with the points that it is true that teaching history was not relevant within the Nigerian context. Because if we are to be honest with ourselves, most Nigerians go to school not just to learn, but to make a better living in the sense of better economic prospects in the future if you have a degree, which is why a lot of Nigerians are all about going to school. It's all about a means to an end. It's not really about, most Nigerians don't go to school because, oh, I want to go and learn. And oh my gosh, I love history. I want to learn history. I want to do African studies, which is different from most other countries. Nigerians go to school, if we're being honest, because it is seen as a means or a way to have a better life economically. So I do agree with the fact that teaching history in a Nigerian setting might not be the best way of utilizing resources, which is why it was removed from the Nigerian curriculum. That could be true. Lack of interest, not having teachers who are qualified to teach history. I do agree with that. That could be a reason. Another thing is that I do agree with the fact that removing it from the Nigerian curriculum does control the narrative, because it is true that most Nigerians cannot really talk with their full chest about the history of Nigeria. Most of Nigerian citizens know more about colonialism. They know more about Lord Lugard and the Niger Delta Bridge, some of the British things, more than they know more about the African kingdoms, the Benin Kingdom, the Edo Kingdom, and some of these other things that are more relevant to the Nigerian and African context. So I do agree with those points. But all in all, I think this is an interesting conversation. I don't think that I think that two things can be true at the same time. I do think that Nigeria did kind of purposely erase some of the things, and I think it was done to decrease the tension, because the tension is still there. The war, the Biafran War, what it did, the tension is still in the country till today, and I think that it was done to kind of reduce that tension. But again, whenever you do something, there are the advantages and disadvantages of it, right? So two things can be true at the same time. There were political reasons, and I still believe there were social reasons as to why. But all in all, I think these are great points that were made in this discussion. I didn't want to get into the comparison between the US and Nigeria because I don't think that is too relevant. You can, if you want to, watch the whole episode, which I encourage, people to do, you can take out some nuggets from it, but in terms of saying contextually to what I'm about on this channel, I didn't see the necessity to go into more details, which is why I stopped where I stopped. But great content, great discussion. Guys, let me know what you think. Do you think that Nigeria actually erased its history to control the narrative in terms of what has happened in the past and how it affects what is happening and where Nigeria is today? I do kind of believe that could play a part, because if you look at Nigeria, man, the presidency is on one side. when you talk about other countries on the continent where you don't have a diversification of thoughts within the governance or within the presidential seat, Nigeria is one of those countries as well, right? So that could be a reason. I also believe that it also kind of an economic reason as to why history was taken out, because most students were, even up till today, you see the least amount of students in the history classes. When I was in secondary school, I think our history class had like 2 or 3 students in there, and I don't think the teacher was making it. I think they fired the teacher after a while, or he had to take 2 classes because there were not enough students interested in history. So I think that could have been a reason as well. But my Nigerian people, man, let me know what you think. Is it good to just say that it was because Nigeria purposely erased its history, or are there other elements as to why history wasn't taught? And history, again, 2025, history was brought back into the Nigerian curriculum. So even in the junior secondary level, history is being taught now, which is great. So I guess they're making up for old times. But guys, let me know what you think. Comment, like, subscribe to the channel. This is Full Chess, guys. Peace.